Good morning. My name is Brent Orell. I'm a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and I'd like to welcome you this morning to the Workforce Futures Initiative. How well does America's workforce system work? We have been gathering as a team, as a working group around this question of what's working in the American workforce system for the past 18 months. We have engaged in a number of conversations that we're going to be talking about, providing you some insight into during that time. These are conversations that we've been able to gather with experts from across the country in a variety of institutions, both from the workforce world and from those who spend their lives researching, trying to understand workforce development programming. So the focus of this work was really, again, what do we think is working in the workforce system and how it might be improved. The second part of our program this morning is going to be devoted to just a very brief overview of the new web portal that we're launching today that can give you access to the conversations that we've been having over the last 18 months. On that website, you'll find summaries of our meetings, transcripts of those meetings, of the conversations that occurred in those meetings, and also the PowerPoints that were used by the experts that we recruited to provide us with their insights around the American workforce development system. And then later in the next few weeks, we'll be adding papers that we've commissioned from leading experts on areas where we thought there was additional need for research on key topics. There'll be around a dozen of those papers coming out in the next month or so, including both papers that again provide some additional research and then responses from people providing alternative perspectives on the same questions. So let's go ahead and advance to our agenda. Josh, thanks so much. We're going to be going to introductions here in a minute. I'm going to let everybody introduce themselves of our four steering committee members that are on the call this morning. We want to just review quickly the Workforce Futures Initiative purpose and objectives, background on the research review sessions, an overview of the findings from those sessions. Then, as I said, we'll take a quick look at the web portal, and then we'll be going to Q&A. You can direct those questions to Josh Boynton, whose address is both in the slide and at the bottom of this slide right now, or on Twitter. And then we'll be dealing with those questions at the end of the presentations. So the folks you see on the call today are all part of the Workforce Futures Initiative Steering Committee. Myself, Brent Orell, I have been working in this field for about 20 years. I served in the George W. Bush administration in a number of positions at the U.S. Department of Labor, including as the acting Assistant Secretary for Employment and Training. I also did about 10 years in private consulting on workforce development related issues. I have been leading the effort on WFI at the American Enterprise Institute. And we'll go now to Greg, and he can introduce himself.
Yeah, thank you, Brent. I'm Greg Wright. I lead the Workforce of the Future initiative at Brookings. And I'm an economist. And so I've been very interested in some of these questions from a research perspective. And just really happy to be on the steering committee. And I think we've learned a ton over the last few months. So very happy to be here.
Harry?
Thank you, Brent. Good morning. My name is Harry Holzer. I'm the John Lafarge professor of public policy at the McCourt School of Public Policy at Georgetown University. I am a labor economist by training. I spent a lot of my career studying the lower end of the labor market and what might make it work better. I am affiliated with Brookings as a non-resident senior fellow, which is how I get connected to this project. And I'm a former chief economist at the U.S. Department of Labor during the Clinton years. But I've been very glad to have the opportunity to participate in this event and in this project.
Rachel.
All right, I'll close this out. I'm Rachel Lipson. As of Friday, I was the director of the Project on Workforce at Harvard University and was a member of the founding team of that initiative. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Project on Workforce, we are a cross-school interdisciplinary effort that's bringing together the Kennedy School, Harvard's Policy School, Harvard Business School, and the Graduate School of Education, and focused around how do we answer questions about building better pathways into good jobs in the US? So doing that work from an interdisciplinary lens as well as kind of a cross-sector lens. And my own interest and background is really sort of at the intersection of research and practice. How do we ask research questions that can truly be relevant in the field for people who are out there doing the work, and then also to the extent that research captures interesting learnings about what's working and what hasn't, how do we disseminate that in ways that can be effective for practitioners? So given that lens and focus, I was excited about this work alongside my colleague David Deming, who is our faculty co-director at the Project on Workforce, as well as the academic dean at the Kennedy School, has spent his life studying the economics of education and the labor market and future of work topics. We are excited to bring some of the work we've been doing at Harvard and partner with AEI and Brookings around seeing what the field at large is thinking about these questions. How can we collectively, hopefully, land at where the evidence is to date and where it needs to be going forward. So thanks to Brent for his leadership and bringing us together, and looking forward to the conversation.
Thanks, Rachel. It's really been an honor to work with the three of you and with David over the last 18 months. This steering committee brings with it not just their own experience, but all of the relationships, webs of relationships, and of other experts. And it's really just been an honor and a humbling experience to spend so much time, been able to spend so much time with people who are so deeply immersed in the field, that really care about policy and about how we can make workforce opportunities better, especially for those who are struggling to get onto the workforce ladder and to advance in employment. So many thanks to all of you, really, for all the time that you've committed. Glad we didn't have to pay you for all that time, because I don't think we could have afforded it. I'd also like to thank, and I would be neglectful if I didn't thank the Walmart Foundation for their very generous support in making all of this possible. We couldn't have done it without them, and they've just been a tremendous support, not just in terms of providing resources, but also additional connections to the workforce development strategy world. So let's go ahead, advance to the next slide. Just a quick review for us, maybe the first time some of our listeners have heard this, but we started out with three objectives for the Workforce Futures Initiative. We wanted to develop concise and actionable reviews of existing research of federal, state, and local policymakers for policymakers at those levels. We wanted to provide a forum for new policy ideas that are grounded in evidence. There are a lot of people doing a lot of interesting work out there. It's not possible to capture all of it. So what we have been trying to focus on are those areas where we could get a grip on some evidence and research and evidence that really could substantiate our recommendations and provide a basis other than it feels like a good idea to do something, because we know the resources are limited, and we want to make sure that that we're putting them to the best possible use. And then we wanted to identify priorities for new research on the future of work and the public workforce system. It's one thing to say, here we are, but what we wanted to try to do is to identify either gaps or areas where we thought there was some promise to push out the frontiers of research around workforce development. So, so far we've had 4 sessions, and we've got a 5th scheduled for next week. Session 1 was on evaluating state and federal workforce policies. What does the evidence actually tell us about what works? The second one was on education and training, the landscape of research evidence. And we got into some of the particulars of evidence-based programs. The third session was on hidden workers, opportunity youth, veterans, and justice-involved individuals. The fourth was on adaptation of the workforce system to new paradigms of thinking about how to better prepare people for the workforce. And then next week, as I mentioned, we have a 5th session scheduled looking at the labor shortage question and its interaction with workforce policy. So I'm going to kick this off, and our method this morning is each of us are going to be taking one topic area and sort of providing a high-level summary of our findings in the particular area that we're talking about. And then we want to have a conversation among the 4 of us to kind of provide some of the nuances and some of the additional information from our conversation, and then we'll move through these next 4 slides that way. As we're going, I encourage you to be sending Josh your questions, things that are on your mind as you listen, observations that you have, and then at the end, what we'll do is go back to those comments and expand on any of the answers that we need to provide, or reactions to any of the observations that you have. So that's our plan. This is meant to be very conversational. I'm going to go through this slide, and I encourage my co-steering committee members here to clarify as we go, and to ask questions and provide additional insights. So my task this morning is to talk to you about what we think the evidence tells us about the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act system and the need for innovation within that system. So these are the things that we feel like we can say with a relative level of certainty about what we see in terms of the system performance. The results from the WIOA disadvantaged worker programs are positive, but they are also modest. There is no evidence of positive results for the WIOA dislocated worker or youth programs that we were able to find and would point to as evidence that they are producing positive outcomes. I think one of the ideas that has stuck with me from the very beginning is something that Harry told us in the initial evidence review, which is that we appear to be stuck in a low resource, low efficacy equilibrium. So we're getting these modest benefits from the WIOA program for disadvantaged adults. But those modest benefits aren't enough to encourage higher levels of investment. Yet without additional funding for these programs, it's unlikely that we'll see a substantial improvement. It boils down to a kind of a workforce policy catch-22 when it comes to WIOA? Do we have low results because we're not making a sufficient investment in the program and therefore discouraging additional investments? And I think this is a key question for us. So another observation from all of this is that WIOA is a very small fraction of our overall investment as a country in training and workforce development. There are many other programs. I'm going to ask Harry to talk about this point in a little bit. One of them is that we don't, at this point, there's a lack of access for Pell Grants around non-credit and short-term training that further complicates access to training services or reduces access to training services. But again, WIOA is a very small piece of this, and we've got all of these other elements that we need to be thinking about as well as WIOA. One of we published an op-ed yesterday under Harry's name on the Forbes magazine site, which covers some of this. But we really believe that new investments should be focused on approaches like sectoral training initiatives that we're going to be talking about here on the next slide, that have strong evidence of success, as well as things like job counseling and supportive services, things like housing, transportation, and childcare, and improvements to labor market information systems that Greg is going to be talking about in a little bit, to strengthen these connections, right? All of these things are about strengthening connections between training opportunities and employment and individuals who are seeking training opportunities and employment. This connective tissue problem that we have is one of our biggest challenges. How do we connect people to the training and workforce opportunities that they need? And so we really think that's where we ought to be putting our new investments, if we have additional investments, is into these approaches that we have this evidence that says this will help, this will produce better outcomes for workers. And then finally, I think our greatest need is for innovation to model approaches for making the WIOA system more agile and responsive to changing labor market and workforce needs. We argue in the op-ed that went out yesterday that states and localities need administrative flexibility to experiment with alternative program structures that coordinate across organizational types, government, business, nonprofit, and worker types, dislocated workers, youth, justice involved, and others, supported by enhanced federal funding, implementation support, in other words, technical assistance, and then evaluation to determine which of these state-led reforms should be replicated. My view of this, and I open this after I'm done with this, I'll open this up to the panel, but my view is that our systems, we can't reform from the top down if we want to get innovation. We don't know enough about what's working to be able to say that we ought to do this overhaul of the entire system. What we do know is we've got a few things that work. We want to talk about those, but we also know what we need desperately, I think, is opportunities for some experimentation and innovation that will generate the kinds of reforms that could be replicated. And so we argue in the op-ed and in forthcoming papers on this that there are methods and ways of getting that kind of innovation started in terms of providing flexibility to states to reorganize with a lot more freedom than they have right now. Okay, so that's enough from me on this. And I wanted to give our panelists, my other fellow panelists here a chance to weigh in, to expand on anything that I've said or anything I've left out that needs to be explained. So I'm going to turn it over to them, and if they don't come up with some brilliant statement, I'm going to call them out and remind them of all of their brilliance and have them come forward with their ideas. So who wants to go first?
I'll take a stab, Brett, under your threat of calling us out. No, I agree with everything you've said. It's a nice summary. WIOA is a small part of the entire job training system in the United States. It's actually considerably smaller than what goes on, for instance, at community colleges. And I think Rachel's going to talk about that in a minute. There's job training monies and other programs. So it's a small piece, and yet it's a critical piece because it's supposed to be the glue that holds workforce development together in the United States. It's the one place where you have a program that's really devoted to worker assistance, worker services, and job training, where really any American can walk into one of the 3,000 one-stop shops around the country and get labor services, get job search assistance, get counseling, and maybe a voucher for some training. But the problem is, number one, it's very, very underfunded. So, for instance, there's less than $1 billion to fund job training for all disadvantaged adults in the United States, less than $1 billion. If you compare that to, for instance, the pieces of Pell Grant that fund such training, it's a quite small amount. There's just over $1 billion for all dislocated or displaced workers, the people who lost their jobs because of trade or technology or things like that. Less than $1 billion for out-of-school youth. So these are really tiny amounts to invest in job training. And by the way, and less than $1 billion to fund those 3,000 job centers, the 3,000 one-stop. It's a very, very small amount of money. And yet it's almost impossible to make a case for more funding because the rigorous evaluation results have been, I would say they have been at best very uneven. So as Brent said, most evaluations show positive impacts for disadvantaged adults who get these training vouchers, but the impacts are really quite small. No results for dislocated workers. We don't even have results for out-of-school youth. But when you think about it, perhaps part of the reason that the impacts are so small is the dollars are so small. So the very few people who set foot in a one-stop actually get a training voucher, an individual training account. Those who get them, they're only worth on average a couple $1,000 a piece. A couple $1,000 again, compared to what's needed and compared to what people get in the Pell Grant system and from other funding sources, it's a very small amount. You really can't expect very much from it. But as long as the impacts are as weak as they appear to be, it's simply, it's just hard to make the case. So that's the catch-22 that Brent mentioned. And most of us, we're not going to get a big infusion of money given these results. And so we really have to try to do other things. And one other thing I'll say, and then let Rachel and Greg get in the conversation. The system is very fragmented as well. You have millions of people who go to community colleges and get job training who never set foot in a one-stop and never get any of the services that are provided there. They go to community colleges, they get very little counseling there, very little job search assistance. But these pieces are often separate, even in local or regional labor markets. And that's a problem, I think, for the system as well. Underfunding, underperformance, fragmentation are all some of the things that we worry about. And I'll stop there.
Harry queued up nicely. We have a forthcoming Project on Workforce white paper that will be released next Thursday on WIOA and on the eligible training provider list in particular. So wanted to tee that up for this for our audience today to stay tuned. And I think it's going to hit on a lot of the points that Harry just previewed around some of these challenges around fragmentation, around the small amount of money that's involved, and also the challenge of doing things strategically when the whole system has been built on vouchers. So I'll share a quick figure for you all, a preview for that work. There, from our analysis, there are over 75,000 programs nationally that are eligible for WIOA vouchers. But of that, there's only about 220,000 people a year probably who receive those vouchers. So that means that each program on average is getting only about 3 WIOA participants per year as enrollees, which makes it really hard to do anything at scale. And I can put my provider hat on for a little bit. I think I'm the only one in the group who used to work at a workforce development organization. I'm an alum of Year Up, spent some time at one of the best organizations out there that has randomized control trial results. And I know we're going to talk in a little bit about the comparatively really strong evidence around sector-based training. But I think the challenge when you compare WIOA to the workforce development providers that have worked is that like an organization like Year Up, their recent evaluation, I think, cited that 2% of their money comes from public funds. And if you think about the stats I just cited, if you're only getting 3 WIOA enrollees per year and the training vouchers average at about, it's like $2,000 per trainee, we spend federally $6,000 in revenue. Not a whole lot of, not really a sustainable way of scaling or funding your operations. So I think one of the challenges, if we look at these evaluations of WIOA that have existed, they've looked at the impact of the program in aggregate and said what happened overall to everyone who came through the doors of our one-stop center. Some received training, some didn't. The reality of anyone who's done training knows is that training programs differ a lot. They differ in terms of what they're training for. They differ a lot in terms of the support services that they offer. We know that wraparound supports matter a ton for completion. They're also more expensive. They matter in terms of how strongly they actually are working with employers or not. And so one of the challenges in reading these evaluations is how do you differ between the programs that are good programs where federal money has gone and programs that are not so good and where these vouchers often have gone as well. So thinking, I think, for the next stage of systems reform for WIOA, but also for the system more broadly, is how do we get more resources towards the training programs that work? And I know our next segment of discussion is going to focus on that. I think that is a key question, and there's a lot of challenges around the voucher system being the exclusive and only way to get there versus some of these more cohort-based models and other forms of sectoral employment where the government might be providing resources to proven providers that have a track record of good results. Let me hand it to Greg and let him close this out.
Yeah, no, I think we can see that the funding issue is the first order issue in some sense, but I'll just sort of second Brent's comment that sort of innovation is probably most likely to come kind of from a bottom-up approach at the state and local level. And this is something we'll talk about a little bit also in the context of labor market information and new data and the way that new data sets are created and the way we understand what's going on in these programs. And I think this is also something that's going to be sort of best to prioritize from a kind of bottom-up approach as well. So I'll just pass it back to Brent.
Great. I mean, what strikes me out of all of your comments is, that we've got this, we've got a very significant challenge on our hands if we're talking about, the nature of the economy, which is extremely dynamic and in flux, constantly changing in terms of skill demands, and the need for lots of flexibility in terms of how people find training, how they get that training, so that they can connect to in-demand employment. And that's where we're going in the next segment. But at the same time, and I think I heard Rachel say this, we don't have, it's very difficult to coordinate a strategy around flexibility. And so this is why I think, again, why we need this innovative, a focus on innovation, because we have to solve that problem. How do we coordinate services and training and access to employment, and have it remain responsive and flexible depending on local and regional economic conditions? So let's go on to the next slide. And I'm going to turn it over to Harry here to talk about the evidence around sectoral training strategies.
Thank you, Brent. So if the research evidence on the WIOA programs has often been disappointing, the research evidence on what we call sector-based training has been very positive and very encouraging. So I'll just take a couple of minutes to describe that evidence and this kind of training. So first of all, what is sector-based training? Well, as the name implies, you start with some key sectors of the economy, the most obvious ones being healthcare, IT, advanced manufacturing, transportation and logistics, and there are some others. These are high demand industries, growing industries, strong demand for workers. They provide good paying jobs for people without bachelor's degrees, jobs that pay what almost anybody would call a living wage. But the problem is workers need a pretty strong skill set, often a very specific set of occupational and industry skills to get those good jobs and to get that high pay. The best examples of these programs, some of the best known examples, Rachel has already mentioned Year Up. That's a program for disadvantaged high school graduates. It's a combination of 6 months of classroom training and 6 months of internship in a particular set of industries. A program called Perscolis started in New York, spread to other areas for disadvantaged adults and older youth, focusing on the IT sector. Project Quest started in San Antonio and community colleges there and has spread elsewhere, heavy focus on healthcare and some other sectors. And what makes this kind of training so special is that the evaluation results, rigorous evaluation results from randomized trials, has been very strong. These programs generate large and lasting impacts on the earnings of workers. When I say large, we're often talking about 30 to 40% increases in the earnings of low earning adults or youth. The impacts seem to last many years. Some evaluations have shown impacts lasting anywhere from 7 to 11 years and likely beyond that. So it's great training with strong impacts. So then I asked the question, well, why? What makes this kind of training so successful? And it appears to be because the skills and credentials that the trainees get are very, very well aligned with what industry needs in these high-paying jobs. Economists talk about the demand side and the supply side of the labor market, where the demand side is the employers, supply side are the workers. And so many training programs just train these workers and send them out, as opposed to sector-based training, where an intermediary has brought together the industry, the training providers, and worked out a body of training, a curriculum of training, and a set of programs that really do meet the needs of these employers. It wins the confidence of employers, and that makes it work well. Some other positive aspects, that there is soft skills training, often integrated into the occupational training, which contributes to making the worker a productive one. Some of the support services that we mentioned before that are very critical for worker success and worker completion, childcare, transportation, job market counseling and placement, they are provided in these programs. So the whole package is very positive. So you say, okay, well, all that sounds great. Then what are the limitations? I'd say there's two limitations. Number one, it's a fairly expensive kind of training. It's not unusual for each trainee needs $10,000, $12,000 in costs to get through one of these programs. And a lot of applicants are screened out. A lot of applicants are deemed not eligible to be allowed into the program, either because their basic skills aren't strong enough, or they don't have basic pieces of work readiness. Maybe they have a substance problem. Maybe they've had other difficulties in their lives. But the basic skills, some of these programs simply will tell you if an applicant is not reading or writing at the 10th grade level, they will not be successful in our program. They will not bring the basic skills needed. So it's the combination of the high costs and the screening out of a lot of people creates small programs that work extremely well. So the major challenges then are pretty obvious. Number one, how do you replicate and scale these very small, successful programs while trying to maintain quality? For instance, since so many millions of workers get their training at community colleges, how can we take the essence of these programs and build them into institutions that can reach, the hundreds of thousands or millions of workers who need that kind of training? How can we reduce the cost to make it more scalable? Maybe some of this training can be done online and done more efficiently. And how do we make this stuff more accessible to the workers who are currently screened out because they don't have basic job readiness, they don't have strong enough basic skills? So if we really want to move the needle in workforce outcomes for the country, these are some of the challenges we have to face, to take these little gems of programs and see if we can expand them in a way that helps a lot more people than they do right now.
So I'd really like to hear Rachel, as a graduate of Europe, as somebody who knows that program intimately. What do Harry's comments sort of provoke in you in terms of what it looks like going through one of these programs from the inside?
Thanks, Brent. And I should clarify, maybe I was sloppy in my own wording too. I used to work at Europe. There's also an amazing, vibrant Europe alumni community of graduates of the program who have gone on and done amazing things in the world. Sadly, don't count myself as part of that, although I think there's lots that I wish my undergraduate experience in college had adapted from Europe in terms of thinking about what happens in the labor market and the skills that you're going to need for work. So, I think a lot of what Harry says is really spot on as we zoom out and think about what it will take to scale what's been learned from sector-based training programs like Europe and make it more possible for more people in this country. The exciting thing, and I don't want to make sure we don't gloss over it, is that what these programs have shown is that training, when coupled with the right set of supports, can work for particularly for low-income adults and for people who have traditionally struggled to access upward opportunities in the labor market. And that's like not a small statement, because I think for many years in this space, there was a lot of skepticism about why should we spend any money on job training, because we don't have proof that it can work. And now we have a very, I think, robust body of evidence that if you couple the right things and the right sets of strategies, both for working with the students as well as working with the employers and the community, that these programs can and have worked and should be given the resources to sustain and multiply, because the returns for the taxpayer are unambiguously positive in terms of lifetime return on investment and in terms of tax revenues and benefits for society. So just want to double click on that point. Harry, I think, has captured, a lot of the challenges that organizations like this are thinking about inside, which is so much of what they've done and their success is not just about the classroom training and what you learn from an instructor, but instead from all of the other types of life things that may get in the way from you being able to start training, complete, and then successfully transition on the job. And a lot of those things are expensive. They are human supports of a whole kind of cohesive community that's there to make sure that you can persist and complete the training program and actually realize the return. So as we move forward, I think on the research side, one of the next frontiers and really exciting parts is these programs have a lot of different components that Harry laid out. There's the piece on investing in employer relations and having a team that really, really works closely with employers in the community to understand the skills that are going to be required to secure placements after completion of training. People do these programs because they know that there is a job on the other side. And if you remove that part of the equation, I think the attraction is a lot less substantial. All of the focus on soft skills and what it's going to take to succeed in the labor market after completion. I think from a research perspective, one of the things that's exciting is how do we understand which of these things are most important and why? And because that will tell us a lot about for the future of policy in this area is how do we prioritize? You could do a million things. You may wind up having a really expensive program that then therefore is not scalable. So I'm interested in following the research on this topic, particularly on understanding out of that whole bundle of services, which pieces really, really matter. There's also a lot of interesting thinking in this space right now around the length and duration of these programs. Harry mentioned Europe is historically a one-year program. In a really strong labor market that we have right now for low-wage workers, I think a lot of young people and others are saying a year is a long time. I don't know that I can take a year to go and do training. And so what's the minimum amount of time that will be required to see the kinds of results that a program like Europe has delivered? I have some questions about this. I think you probably do need some substantial amount of time learning new skills, but figuring out the right duration. And one thing I'll mention here too that I'm not sure if Harry laid out is that a lot of these programs like Europe historically have offered stipends while you learn. And this is a growing dynamic that we're seeing in the field of sector-based training. Again, given how strong the low-wage labor market has been right now, if you can make $22 an hour at Target, it becomes a really hard proposition to say, I'm going to drop out of the labor market, go do training full-time and make no money and be unable to support my family and my dependents. And so just to be competitive in attracting both young people and older adults into these programs, the programs that are able to offer some financial support while you do the training, either from the employer or from the government or from nonprofits, are at an advantage. And so I do think it's time from a public policy perspective how we think about updating some of our priors on this, where government has historically been very reluctant to use public funds to pay for training stipends. But if people are not going to be able to stay in and complete otherwise, they actually can become a really critical component of why these programs work.
That's excellent. Thanks, Rachel. Greg, I want to give you a chance to get in here too.
I just wanted to kind of add this additional challenge, which is the kind of economic development side of things, right? So these sector-based training programs are sort of assume the existence of these, fast-growing sectors, and a lot of it is that's just sort of a separate issue too, which is the economic development perspective. How do we bring these sectors to these areas? And make it so that the training is going to be useful and effective. And again, it's in some sense a separate issue, but it's kind of a good opportunity to somewhat to plug Rachel's future position, which is she's moving on to work on the implementation of the CHIPS Act. And the CHIPS Act, so it's sort of this industrial strategy perspective, which is in some ways complementary, I think, to these sector-based training programs, because that's the other side of the coin, right? That's the demand side of this process, which is creating these jobs and setting people up to exploit and leverage these training programs. So just wanted to add that sort of additional and big challenge that we face here.
So I had just a couple additional thoughts. First, on the replication and scaling point, there's an awful lot that goes on in terms of training that gets called sectoral strategy or sector-based training. But we're talking about a very specific program model that has been, or models, I should say, it's more than one model, but that have been rigorously evaluated. And I think it's really one of the initial steps in the scaling process, I think, is, clarifying what we mean when we say sectoral strategy, that it does include the soft skills training, that it does include the supportive services and the job counseling and these well-developed networks of employers, and then trying to do what we can to educate the overarching system, not just WIOA, but community colleges, and apprenticeship, and other technical training programs, that not everything that calls itself sectoral training strategies is what we're talking about here. These are intensive, expensive. I would argue, to Harry's point, that going from between $8,000 and $9,000, which is, I think, is what we typically spend, at least on the disadvantaged youth side of which the one that I'm most familiar with, it's typically been in that range. If we had programs that could deliver results for an additional $3,000 per person, that feels like, to me, a much better result than spending the $9,000 and not getting anything, or getting very little out of our current investments. So when we think about the value
I think we may be losing Brent. It's on the other side too.
Yes, I can't hear him either.
Which is sad, because I think he was making a very compelling case for why we may need to spend more to see better results, which is always a great argument to hear from AEI. So maybe we can exchange a few thoughts. Any other additional thoughts on sector-based training, which is, I think, one of the challenges here for public policy has been, I talked a little bit about how much of WIOA spending on training is through vouchers, and these programs in some ways are we need new streams of funding that can support programmatic operations for proven providers that we don't currently have a lot of right now. We've done a lot of we have some competitive grant opportunities that have supported models like this, whether it was the Trade Adjustment Assistance for Community College program, or the Good Jobs Challenge, or back in the early days of the Obama administration, the Social Innovation Fund. But right now, there's not, I would argue, not a lot of formula funding that can strategically go towards investing and scaling these programs. I'm curious, though, if you agree with that take, Harry and Greg.
I do. I think the funding is very limited. But the flip side of the coin, I think, and I think Brent alluded to this, is just because we call something sectoral doesn't mean it has the quality of a Project Quest or a Per Scholas. And I think there are, and that's why it is so important to isolate exactly what makes those programs so special. I've seen a lot of sector-based programs in a number of community colleges that are much, much less impressive, and some of them do have weaker results. So it really is, getting it right. How do you do it the right way? And how do you get the resources targeted to exactly those things that work?
Yeah, sorry, I had a little technological problem there, and I'll close us out on this topic so we can move on. But just to say that I think that there are strategies and to encourage the adoption of things that we have at least an idea that they work in terms of sectoral strategies in the way that we fund federal grants. And Rick Hendra and I are working on a paper on sector-based training from MDRC, Rick from MDRC, who really understands this in great depth. He and I have partnered around this to talk about some ways of driving dollars toward effective practice, so that to the extent that we're investing new money in sector-based training, that we're actually investing in the stuff that at least looks like the things that we think work, rather than sort of all-comers approach, anybody who's got something that's sector-based on it. So let's move on to the next piece of this conversation is around community colleges. And Rachel, you're up. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Brent. And yeah, I'm really excited to see that paper. I think it's a great example of this initiative and the kinds of things we can help push forward. I think the thoughtful pairing of someone like Rakendra and Brent to think about how we take what we've learned from the evidence and translate that into policy is exactly the kind of thing we've been hoping to achieve. So I haven't read it yet, but I'll pitch it, and I'm excited to check it out. All right, I'm going to be pretty brief here because I'm excited for us also to leave a little time at the end to exchange with the folks who called in. We've spent a lot of time over the last year and a half talking about community colleges, in large part because I would argue that they, in a lot of ways, are the most important institution and player in determining whether the American workforce system works or will work or can work, because they have the most substantial infrastructure, the most substantial investment. They are everywhere in America at pretty much every community. They also, if you think about the post-secondary landscape, they serve the most socioeconomically diverse segments of the U.S. population, and they also racially serve the most diverse segments and representative segments of the U.S. population, and older adults, working parents, immigrants, etc. This is where people historically have come to seek out workforce training. So they are and will continue to be critical. The evidence base here, I'd say, is a lot larger than what we've seen on WIOA. There's a much more substantial body of evidence and papers and literature out there that it's hard to give you a 2-minute summary of. But one thing I'll say is that there's a lot of heterogeneity. In the context of this group, in our conversations, we focused a lot of our review on workforce-focused programs at community colleges, which, to be clear, are not at all the exclusive mission of community colleges. In a lot of cases, and in a lot of states, actually, more liberal arts-focused programs and general studies, AAs, et cetera, are extremely common and in some ways receiving equal, if not more, attention. But we focus our conversation in a lot of ways on what community colleges can do for workforce. And we see overall a lot of positive signals that community college programs can deliver positive earnings impacts and lifetime earnings impacts. But this varies depending on institution. It varies depending on programs, and in particular also on completion, whether someone actually finishes the program, which has historically been a challenge for a lot of community colleges. Some of the strongest results in the literature have been in fields like in healthcare and community college nursing programs, really strong literature around returns to those investments, as well as other types of technical and IT fields. I'll let Harry, I think, speak a little more to what he's seen of types of occupations and programmatically what seems to work. We also know, though, that community colleges have often struggled with providing the type of supportive services and wraparound supports that we just spoke about were so critical for the success of the sectoral employment programs. But there is some promising evidence out there that when they invest in these things, they have a substantial, significant impact on both completion and post-graduation outcomes. The most notable study that's often discussed in this space is an evaluation of CUNY's ASAP program, where students received extra supports, including from counselors and from Metro cards, and had positive ROI, statistically significant impact on completion. And then another, I think, a big theme that we've discussed over the last 18 months that where I'd say the evidence base is a bit more nascent, but the public policy momentum is strong, and lots of energy right now is about the role of shorter term credentials in community colleges. Survey evidence of workers shows, as I was discussing earlier, that a lot of workers are interested in non-degree options. They want shorter programs. But historically, we have not had a funding stream to specifically support community colleges in providing those types of work, those types of programs. And so I think on the research side, there's a huge need right now to understand which of these programs work and why, if they do, so we can understand how we best invest in supporting the growing appetite of workers to pursue new types of curriculum at community colleges that connect directly to not just to a first job, but to upward mobility and careers. So that's my quick summary. I'll pass it over to my colleagues, Greg, Harry, and Brent. I know have all done a lot of work in this space, and excited to hear their take here.
Just because my internet keeps going in and out, let me say something, which is I was really taken and impressed in the session that we had on community colleges, just how large these institutions often are, how many students they are attracting, even though enrollment's down a little bit, I think, and how scarce the resources are that we would think about in terms of encouraging completion. The helping students sort of find their way through the community college system is quite limited. We want, for good reason, I think, we want to put a lot of money toward training, but we don't have the systems in place to help people navigate. And with some kids in this age bracket, I can tell you that they would greatly benefit, not just at the community college level, but also at the college and university level, from more resources to help them figure out which way's up when it comes to pursuing training. And in the case of Ann Kress from the Northern Virginia Community College, she talked about how they have essentially one counselor, job counselor, and training counselor in this case for about every 1,000 students, and that really struck me, has stayed with me. That's almost worse than doing nothing, because it's just impossible in a system as large as Northern Virginia Community College system to have much of an impact with that kind of ratio.
And I'll add a few thoughts here, and I mostly want to focus on Rachel's point number 4 about not-for-credit and short-term programs. So 2 issues. Number 1, we have much less evidence on the non-credit side. The vast majority of our data from states are on for-credit programs. We have a lot of research on for-credit, very little on not-for-credit. I wrote a report a couple of years ago with Sandy Baum and Grace Lutmer at the Urban Institute, where we did have one data set, the American Training and Employment Survey, providing some credit, some data in non-credit, and the impacts are weaker than in the for-credit side. Shorter-term programs, they're weaker than medium or long-term. There's very high variance. Some of the stuff works and some doesn't. That's true about everything, but it's especially true in this realm. And there's a fear, I think, about if you start opening the floodgates of higher ed money, how do you make sure the money goes to programs that have real value add and that work? And there's just as there's very, very little money in WIOA, there's a ton of money in the Higher Ed Act, and especially what we call Title IV for Pell Grants and federal loans. But the money is restricted now by 3 rules. Number 1, it has to be at an accredited higher ed institution. It's got to be a 4 academic program, and it's got to be not terribly short term, like at least 6 months in length. maybe those rules are too limiting. And we know that there's been an effort for a number of years, a bipartisan effort by Senators Tim Kaine and Rob Portman, former Senator Rob Portman, to try to weaken some of those rules around Pell and around Title IV, and to make that money more available for short term and even for some not for credit. I have some sympathy for that effort. And yet, how do you make sure that you have what's going to be the form of accountability once you pry open that door for the non-accredited institutions, the not-for-accredited programs, to make sure that the money is well spent and not, there are a lot of actors in this space, especially in the for-profit space, that do not appear to generate very good value added for the money. And so how do you separate out that wheat and that chaff if you open the gates and allow more programs to come through? So it's a very important issue. Some community colleges, and Rachel knows a lot about this, are making innovative efforts to try to braid for credit money with other things. I mean, we talk about some of those funding innovations, but to me, that's the key dilemma in all this.
You were
Right.
muted, but I think you asked if I had something
Yes,
to
I did. Sorry.
I don't have too much to add. I would only say, and this is something I won't talk about this much later, but Rachel had mentioned that there's this huge body of research, and this huge body of research on community colleges and really on the for credit programs has benefited a lot from these data sets that have linked community college student records with a UI worker information. And so, it's really over the past sort of decade that states have started to do this. And this has been a huge value add. I mean, this has given us, really new insights into the way that these different programs translate into short and long-term employment outcomes. So I think that's been really valuable. And so while there is a lot of heterogeneity in student outcomes, I think we actually have a decent grasp on that heterogeneity and what types of programs are successful and what sort of programs are not.
It's a great call out, Greg, and it also, I think, illuminates, though, on the flip side, that we don't have that data or information on the non-credit side, and it's a huge gap as we move forward into the new frontier that Harry described. Is how do we, because the iPad system does not collect any information on non-credit programs, and we don't have right now a good way of tracking completers of non-credit. This seems like something that higher ed and the research community together will have to tackle if we are to be able to understand how these investments going forward, whether they work and whether they don't, and why and under what conditions.
Well, this is a great segue to you, Greg, in terms of our labor market information discussion. So why don't you go ahead and talk about what we're learning there?
Yeah, well, we had a great panel on labor market information in our last WFI session. And I mean, it was, in particular, I think it was nice because we had a great representative from sort of the groups a group that is producing these private data sets. We had Matt Siegelman from the Burning Glass Institute. And then we had good representation from those who have been responsible in many ways for some of the publicly available data sets that have come out in the last few years and continue to be created right now. So so we had Matt Siegelman from the Burning Glass Institute, and then we had Julia Lane from NYU and the Coleridge Initiative talking about some of the efforts that she's been making to not only to kind of produce new public data sets, from linking things across the government agencies, Census and Bureau of Labor Statistics, but also increasing access to these data sets for researchers and policymakers. And then we also had Jason Palmer from the Chicago region BLS, and he was talking a little bit about some of the regional efforts to improve data availability. So first, I'll just say a little bit to begin with about kind of summarizing, I think, Matt Siegelman's comments, which were, first of all, of course, the value of some of these, private data sets, like really what I'm thinking of here is, the job postings data, the resumes data, this type of really granular and high frequency data. And I think Matt's main point, which is a good one, I agree with, is that a lot of what's been done so far is effectively descriptive, right? You can take these data sets they're so new and they're so potentially informative, that there's just been a lot of just digging into the data and understanding from a kind of counting perspective the types of insights that they can provide. But really the next step that and others have already done some of this, but the next step is really using these data as inputs into more sophisticated economic modeling exercises, and using them to understand some of the things that economists and others have been exploring for a long time. The nature of structural changes and their impacts on the workforce, and how will technology affect workers, but doing all of these things at a much more local level, and potentially also at a much more high frequency level. And so, the potential value here is huge. So these types of data sets, I think, are going to be, they're already used very widely. They're going to be used even more and in more increasingly sophisticated ways. But this was a nice discussion, because it's sort of, now we can kind of contrast that with some of the innovations in publicly available data, or public data sets, like Census and Bureau of Labor Statistics. And Julia Lane has been really at the forefront of linking data sets, creating new data sets, and pushing for wider access to those data sets. So I think her main takeaway, which again I agree with, is that a lot of the innovation that's happening at that level is happening at the local and state level, and should be happening at that level, and will continue to happen at that level, and largely because state and local governments have their own priorities, and they understand, where the value of these linking exercises are going to come from. So she gives lots of examples about the way that state and local governments are sort of exploiting data sets and bringing them together in innovative ways to produce policy insights that are useful for those regions. And then, from there, once you have these kind of local or state level data linking exercises, they can be made more widely available to researchers, or they can be harmonized and integrated into more national types of data access processes. One important point that she makes that I wanted to make sure I mentioned is that a lot of these data have become more widely available to researchers and policymakers. In part, that's because of technological innovation. We can, the advent of all of this remote access has happened very quickly, of course, because of the pandemic. And so now researchers can access a much wider range of data. But at the same time, there's been really important changes to the legal environment, or sort of more innovative legal structures to facilitate these data linking projects as well. And that's been really important. The last thing is, again, from this bottom-up perspective of where are new data sets going to come from, and how are they going to inform policymaking. I think Jason Palmer from the BLS gave some really interesting examples of these demonstration projects that they are kind of instigating and promoting in the Chicago region, where policymakers can kind of propose data linking projects that they think would help them to inform the policy decisions that they're making. And then some of the data providers can go off and perform those linking projects and see how they work, and use them as demonstrations for how new innovative data sources can inform policy. So that's kind of a lot of stuff, but let me just stop there and pass it to my colleagues here.
So the name that's come up a couple times in your presentation is Julia Lane, and she's actually working on two papers for us. One, really looking at this question of how we can incentivize and support these local / regional, state and regional collaboratives, and that paper we should be able to post that to the WFI site shortly. And I think it's really provocative in terms of reimagining labor market information away from kind of a centralized federal approach, and more toward a regional, decentralized approach that's more responsive to local economic conditions and can be made more relevant to local education, training, planning, and economic integration with economic development that you mentioned earlier, Greg. That's kind of one thing I just want to put on people's radars is that we are going to be putting that paper out soon. The second project that I've engaged Julia on is the use of artificial intelligence for this is a massive data project, and that's what AI is supposed to be able to do, is to manage masses of data and coordinate it better and pull out the patterns that are actionable. So we're looking forward to that conversation with her as well as move forward on this project.
I'll just add one quick comment to all this because Greg did a really nice job summarizing what we know and where things were headed. And Brett, you just mentioned AI. AI will be great for data systems, but it will likely cause a lot of displacement of workers and a lot of skill obsolescence. A lot of workers who've got great training of the kind we've described may find those skills obsolete as automation takes off in the future. We're going to need much better data to understand that process, to really understand in a world of automation who gets retrained for other work or who gets displaced. For those displaced people, where do they come back in? And Julia has talked a lot about this. What kinds of skills do people need to get reemployed in a decent job without a long period of time? So as we look to the future, I think that having good data will be more critical than ever before. And it will have to be much better data of the kind Greg described to really give us insight into these issues.
I'll just add quickly a final word, maybe from a different angle, which is about how do we make labor market information a little more human-centered for the end users. I've often found that a lot of the conversation around LMI hasn't been as focused on, like, how do we actually imagine that a worker takes this information and is able to usefully deploy it in making decisions about jobs and careers and training and education. And so I'm kind of interested as we head into the next generation of reforms, whether it be WIOA reauthorization or such, like, how do we ensure that we don't equate some of the metrics that we use to understand system performance with, and just turn those back towards here's information for workers that will be useful to them. I think a lot about these like quarterly 1 and quarterly 3 earnings metrics, for instance, of trying to understand programs is not really that useful for people who are trying to make that decision. And so how do we get more feedback from workers themselves about what kind of labor market information is useful to them and in what forms, and put some focus and effort towards translating this information in ways that consumers can actually take it, make sense of it, and hopefully utilize it for better decision making.
Okay, let's move on. We want to just for a second show you the website. This is live as of this morning, so please go look at it. But just very briefly, what you'll find on this page is, or on the website, is the ability to access right now the information from the previous sessions in terms of transcripts of the 4 Workforce Futures Initiative conversations, as well as the PowerPoints of the presenters, and summaries written by the members of the steering committee that kind of pull out the key lessons and learning from those sessions. So I would encourage you to visit. You can also sign up on this webpage to be able to receive updates as we upload new research to it that we've commissioned from a variety of authors, including some who have been mentioned here this morning. you'll get updates that papers are available, and be able to access them on a variety of topics. So that's kind of, we're not going to do like a walkthrough here, but I just wanted to just show you, this is what you should be looking for. The link there is at the bottom. I encourage you to go in and sign up to get the email updates. So here we are at the discussion. Lots of good questions coming in. And I think what I'd like to do is start. We've got an interesting question here, and that we've debated internally, actually, about on sectoral training, about the issue of screening out or creaming. And I think it would be helpful if we kind of went into that a little bit. I've got some thoughts on it, but I'd like to give Harry and Rachel and Greg the first sort of bite at this apple. How big a concern is this?
Well, so the question from Howard Husock is, why do we talk about it so much? Shouldn't we be happy just to be helping the people who are capable of successfully using help? And Howard, you're exactly right about that. There are likely hundreds of thousands of people out there right now who do have the work readiness and the basic skills to benefit from these programs, and we are nowhere near providing enough scale in these programs to meet that need. So absolutely, it would be a great thing to scale up for the people who can use it and right now and aren't getting it. Having said that, there's another issue in my experience in this world that often comes up, and you have some of my friends, I would say more in the progressive community, who have the view that when you're allocating resources, you allocate resources according to people's needs. I know there's an historical antecedent for that point of view, but that's a view. You know, for people who with the weakest skills, they should get most of the dollars to bring them up to speed. And at one level, from a justice point of view, we like that point of view. But from an effectiveness point of view in workforce training, it just doesn't work. Too many of those people with the most barriers and with the least job readiness simply aren't in position to take advantage of these kinds of programs. So both those things are true simultaneously. We need a lot more resources and a better knowledge of scaling up for the people who can take advantage, as well as probably other things, maybe subsidized employment for the people who likely would not be ready. And there's a real question of how do we stretch these programs? So if the program administrator is saying, I can't use anyone below the 10th grade level, are there ways of bringing people a little below that level up to the starting line so they can benefit, and doing that in a cost-effective way? So these are just some of the challenges, I think, in trying to do all this.
Rachel?
Look, I guess this was one of these terms that when I came back more deeply in the research community, I was like, what are they talking about, this screening out? Because if you talk to the admissions folks at Europe, I don't think they perceive that that's what they're doing in the admissions process. Instead, it's a pretty open door policy with some basic conditions that they've set around who's eligible to apply. And then a lot of what happens is like expectation setting from the time that you express interest to enrollment in the program is a bit of a longer tail here, where you're trying to test out, does someone have the interest, commitment, perseverance, dedication to be able to make it through the program and set the right norms around that. So it's not necessarily so much of a hard skill test, but instead really trying to get at that some of these motivational questions, because they only want people to make that commitment who are going to be able to see it through. Because everything we know, again, the last thing that we want is for people to start training programs and then drop out of them and have nothing at the end to show for them in terms of credentials or better earnings potential. I guess one of the things I've been struck by in like the focus on this in the research community is it does seem to me a little bit not as aligned with what I hear from practitioners on the ground, which is that everyone has been struggling to fill their seats in this environment because there are a lot of there's the gig economy. There are a lot of better paying jobs that don't require additional skill attainment that are available with wages that have been growing, which I think is a good thing. Training providers are actually just having a hard time like making the case to people why they should forego some earnings in the short term to make this longer term investment in their human capital. So to me, that is actually like the bigger challenge we should be focused on, is why are people finding it so hard to go and invest in training in the first place? And is there something fundamentally structurally wrong about the way we've been doing training? If we're, in a lot of cases, we've been asking people to train for jobs that maybe don't have a good tail end upward mobility trajectory, and they're making a pretty rational choice to stay out of training altogether. And that's to the detriment of the country if we think that our competitive advantage in the 21st century is going to be that we outscale and outtrain and build the best human potential that we can in the world. We need to find ways to incentivize and keep more people in good quality training. So I guess I would just be like, I'm a little more focused on that question than I am on like, who are we holding out of training right now, is like, how do we bring more people in and what's it going to take to make them successful in those environments?
Greg, did you have anything you wanted to add?
No, those were two excellent perspectives. I don't have anything to add. Thanks.
Okay. I mean, the only thing I would add on the creaming question was I recall that when Larry Katz was providing his overview of the evaluation of sectoral training, he was actually quite adamant, firm at least, that we need not worry about this for the reasons I think that Harry and Rachel have already articulated. In addition to which, I thought it was an important point that he made, that these programs add substantially to the diversity of our workforce. They are providing opportunities for individuals in disadvantaged communities to reach that escape velocity from low-wage jobs. And that in itself, I think, is a huge benefit. To Howard's point in his question, we need now to be focusing on providing opportunity to those in disadvantaged communities who are best positioned to take advantage of it, in part because of the longer term impact that those people can have in terms of providing plausible pathways in their own communities, examples of how this works. So I tend to agree here that this question of the justice side of this needs not to overwhelm our sense of doing a lot of good, or a lot of good that can be done through these programs. So we have a couple other questions here relating to problems within the WIOA system. Are we really getting much of a benefit from the WIOA system? What about reforming the WIOA system? I'll just say from my standpoint that I agree with the sentiment here in terms of, we do have these sort of very modest positive results for one segment of WIOA funded programs, disadvantaged adults, but that we really ought to be doing better, even with our limited resources. And I think the pathway to getting to better on this does not involve a full-scale reform of WIOA from the top down. Like I said, I think what we need to do is to incentivize and enhance the resources and administrative flexibilities that are available to states to be able to build systems that meet their needs, what they view as their own needs. And the example I always go back to here is the state of Utah's workforce reform, which has taken 30 years of work to realign and to create the efficiencies and the the elimination of redundant bureaucracies and infrastructures to drive more resources toward workers so they can get the training and supports that they need in order to reach self-sufficiency. That's why I think our energy is best spent not in trying to adjust the dials on the existing system, although I think there are some things that we can do and we should do, but our real energy should be focused on how we can incentivize reform and innovation at the state and local, regional levels, rather than thinking that somehow we can redesign the system from the top and hope to get to a good result. So I hope that answers the several questions that we got relating to that. I don't know if anybody else has thoughts on in response to this this challenge of the sort of the clunkiness and of the existing Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act.
Just one quick comment, Brent, on your idea of incentives for state and local actors and for regional actors. So one example of that was the TACT grants that were giving out during the Obama years, focused on community colleges, but very much for the community college to improve the quality of the regional system and to work better with economic development actors, the workforce system. And that's one example, I think, of it's a competitive grant structure, whether they should do that or make something more formula, but something more incentive-based, I think, at the regional level for community colleges and workforce folks and economic development folks to better use what's already out there. And that would just be one example of incentivizing, I think, that kind of innovation, at least some version of that once again.
I'll just add a quick word on the comments on the AJCs and lots of interesting discussion percolating in our chat here. I do think that there's some low-hanging fruit around technology investments in the workforce system that are long overdue. So during the pandemic, we've seen a lot of, the hood was pulled off on UI that are the systems we've been using are ancient and creaky. Unfortunately, we didn't see the same kind of focus on the job center side and on the training list and the state websites for workforce services. It's hard to imagine a world where we can leverage technology better to do some of these self-service objectives that are set out in the legislation if we are trying to do them on 25-year-old data systems. So I guess I'm very interested in the push for modernization to start moving into the 21st century, because it's hard to ask states to do these things without any resources to support upgrading the underlying technological infrastructure that will be required to think differently and more innovatively about how we best serve the most people.
Right, and just to keep up, not even keep up, to stop falling even further behind of the general trend of technological innovation that's going on in the rest of the economy. I mean, we're already probably decades behind the leading edge, which will, it's government's not likely to ever get there, but that continuing lag in the technological systems can't help but sort of end up reading out of the conversation the publicly funded workforce system. It's just not, it struggles for relevancy now, and I think it will struggle for relevancy even more if we don't make the necessary investments to try to bring its systems into alignment, but at least to some degree with what the pace of technological change. Anybody, Greg, did you have anything you wanted to add on either of these things, or on the WIOA system questions of inefficiency and how we can do better with what we have?
No, I'm fine.
Okay, terrific. Okay, well, we are exactly at time. I want to thank again profusely Harry and Rachel and Greg and David for their active participation in the midst of crowded schedules in this Workforce Futures Initiative. It is an honor working with you, and I'm looking forward to continuing to do that. I want to remind everyone that if you want to be part of the community of learning that's going on here, please sign up for those email updates so that you can get notification on the research papers that are coming out. And just as an FYI, on the previous slide, we had a link for the website. That's a link for you to write down and then type in. It's not a hyperlink, so you'll need to do that if you want to get access to the website, which I hope you will. So again, thanks so much to all the panelists, to all my colleagues on the steering committee, and to Walmart for its support, and to all of the practitioners and researchers who have participated in, contributed to the Workforce Futures Initiative so far, and we look forward to continuing to work with you.
Thanks to you as well, Brent, for your leadership.
Yeah, thank you, Brent.